And welcome to anybody who may be listening on today's recording. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Measuring Access Using Crowdsourced Travel Behavior Data, the easy button to real access and equity. Let me tell you a little bit about our presenter today. Dr. Phil Lassley is an associate research scientist with Texas A&M Transportation Institute's Mobility Analysis Program, where he's worked for over 11 years on a variety of projects, including performance measure uh, development, multimodal mobility, and non-motorized data, housing location choice, and transportation data visualization. He also managed the coordinated congestion and mobility related projects within TTI's Policy Research Center, providing policy research information and educational materials to the Texas State Legislature. With that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Phil. So Phil, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Can everybody hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Perfect. And actually, I have been promoted since that bio was written. I am now a full research scientist. I'm a real scientist. And I'm also the assistant program manager for our mobility analysis program. But we really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the research that we've been working on this past year, are still working on, and something that I've actually been kind of tinkering with for the last several years. My colleagues, Olivia Wang, Jack Kong, and Jordan Gregory, have been working very hard on this project, and it's honestly been really interesting to research, to learn about, and we are very proud to discuss what we have done today. So, there has been a recent push in the last several years for state DOTs and MPOs to begin integrating accessibility measures into their transportation planning efforts. This is generally done to improve multimodal and equity planning efforts in their jurisdictions, to lessen the dependence on motor vehicles over time, or to spur better land use and growth in their community. The idea being that since access as a concept is broad and covers multiple modes, the land use transportation connectivity, and a host of other aspects, using access measures would increase transportation equity. And this is probably pretty true, or at least would do a better job than how we're measuring things now. However, there are a few issues that many states and local regions have run into when trying to do this. Ultimately, access measures are just as bad as some of the other measures in general. I know that might sound a bit harsh, but let's take a deep breath and talk about this in the planning process just a little bit. So, let's talk about what makes a good measure. A good measure is easy to calculate. It must have a relatively simple theory behind it, have readily available data, and must be pretty easy to teach to others on a practical level. What I mean by that is teach one of your colleagues to calculate it just as you can. They're also easy to explain, especially to a lay audience. And it's a bonus if it reflects their reality, much like some of the delay concepts do. And that's what makes some of those other mobility measures really popular. They need to be easy to create policy from. And by this, I mean they are able to set targets or goals from the measures and seeing if those are being met. In the planning process, specifically the project programming phase, projects are often evaluated and funded based on how well they'll meet these set policy targets or goals and how well they'll, quote, improve the system or not. This is tricky because what gets measured matters. And if you're using incomplete measures or bad measures, you have poor policy outcomes. And if you use the use of these measures perpetuates the creation of data to further calculate those measures. So you're kind of stuck in this weird cycle of myopic thinking. And finally, good measures are grounded in measurable real behavior. We learned long ago that while forecasting, modeling, and estimates are extremely helpful in many ways, there's no substitute for real observed behavior. This is all generally why delay-based mobility measures have been so readily used in the past. Mobility measures generally meet these criteria, But we've seen over the decades of use, or more really misuse, that these types of measures have created transportation systems that can be efficient, but the land use patterns are not. And this creates or compounds equity and other issues that decreases the overall livability in an area. So, why the push for access and accessibility measures? Let's talk about access as a concept. It's generally much broader in scope and covers more aspects of livability in the urban fabric than just mobility, connectivity, or other aspects of transportation. As a refresher, access and accessibility refers to a traveler's overall ability to reach desired destinations or activities. This is often summarized to how many destinations one can reach in a given period of time. Now, this differs from mobility, which is simply the ease of movement from one origin to a destination. These two concepts are sometimes confused, but think of it this way. Access is like a faucet with many different drains to different buckets. Mobility is the set of pipes leading to those buckets and how easily water flows through those pipes to each bucket. So in theory, the more buckets you provide in an urban fabric, the more opportunities that are available for people. And these opportunities can include jobs, food, financial resources, social activities, delivery options, etc. So as we as a society begin to address equity more broadly as a point of overall livability, access seems like a natural choice to pursue. And honestly, it is. So why haven't we done so yet? That's the big question. If this theory, which has actually been around for about 75 years, covers some of the big planning issues, why haven't we integrated it more completely into our planning process? It's a great question that I get asked all the time, and the problem ultimately comes down to three things: the performance measures used to calculate access, the data needed to calculate it, and the difficulty in changing entrenched way of doing things. Now, let's talk about the measures themselves. There are actually several different types of accessibility measures that have been developed over time on many different aspects. And these generally can be grouped into four different categories. And I've seen these categories called about 100 different things, so bear with me. First, you have cumulative measures, which include things like spatial separation, distance, infrastructure, think travel time, distance, cost. You have gravity measures, which look at the number of attractors to a given population. Think maximizing the number of employment locations for a maximum number of people. You have utility measures, which are similar to gravity measures, but look at the increased utility a person may gain when more destinations become available. And you have constraint measures, which are also known as activity or space-time measures, which consider several different constraints as limiting variables. Now, I am not doing any of these justice in the 2 minutes I've just spent explaining them, and that's part of the problem. Recall back that when we were talking about what makes a good measure. Accessibility measures, while there is solid theory behind them, are fundamentally difficult to explain quickly to people. The theory behind the measure itself, and the outputs of the measure, this is a good example, or a good example of this would be like a heat map. I know a lot of you have probably seen those accessibility heat maps, and you'll see some today. But have you ever tried actually explaining one of those to somebody, like in detail? You look at it and you feel like you should be able to intuitively make sense out of it, but then you start talking and it becomes really weirdly difficult to explain. That's a serious issue when you're dealing with measures. Also, recall that a good measure is easy to calculate. Nearly all of these measures are not. State DOTs and local agencies often complain that they must employ like a full-time employee or an FTE specialist to understand the theory and who understands either modeling or GIS systems, only to then purchase software or outside consulting services to calculate the measures for them. And good luck having this person teach another coworker. Even with these issues so far, we haven't even gotten to the data part. Accessibility measures are often plagued by the issue of having too little, incomplete, or non-existent, or frankly expensive data used to calculate them. And then also remember that the measures must be easy to explain to others, especially a policymaker, who must then operationalize the measure into policy goals and targets. So there's even with these issues, there's another really massive theoretical issue with all accessibility measures. Accessibility measures do not actually measure real decisions. What they do a really good job of is identifying the universe of possible options a person could choose. Now, this is an issue because while a person may have numerous options open to them, they will only functionally go to a few places, some of which may be outside of the zone of what is marked as highly accessible. Now, not to dive into too much theory here, but there's a fundamental theory backing much of the planning thought behind access and accessibility measures. And that's the assumption of self containment. It's the idea that if you make some area more accessible, people will quote unquote self contain and make fewer, shorter trips or use a different mode. You often hear this as those kitschy live, work, play planned developments. The problem with self containment theory is that it has been shown to not work or not work very well. This is because of another fallacy in transportation planning thought that I often see, and which I actually did my dissertation on. It's the assumption that people make location choices mostly based on transportation choices. However, there's a lot of research that shows that transportation isn't in the top three issues that impact that location decision. It's actually kind of middle tier. People will often make seemingly irrational transportation choices even though their access to desired destinations may be really high. Now, this doesn't mean that increasing access won't make a dent in this. Research has also showed that neighborhood character, walkability, and cuteness or hipness do rank really high in that location choice. All that being said, it would be really helpful for everyone if there were some sort of accessibility or access like measure that measures real behavior. So let's talk about this project. All that was my prelude into this project specifically. The purpose of this project is to develop a preliminary set of really simple access or access like measures using data that's a little easier to get and that measures actual behavior. Now, when we did this, we set out with a couple goals in mind that we wanted to guide us. We wanted to keep things simple for calculation and explanation. We wanted to develop and refine accessibility theory suitable for obtainable observed data, develop measures that are suitable for policy and target setting, create a framework that reflects real behavior, and then finally pre-calculate some of these measures for the Urban Mobility Report's 101 urban areas, possibly even all 494 urban areas. This removes the need for states or cities to do a lot of the legwork themselves when they can get it for free. And then integrate it into a new generation of urban mobility report that for the first time actually talks about access. So, how are we going to do this? We had a couple steps. The first two were kind of simultaneous. We had to identify as many accessibility measures as we could possibly find and assess them for what they measured, how they measured it, and what data they needed, or how useful they have been. This is important later on because we had to match and then morph some of the underlying concepts that could form the basis of a new theoretical approach. We then had to identify data sets that states generally have access to or could easily obtain access to, or something the federal government could eventually supply for free, much like it did with the National Speed Data Set through the NPM RDS program. Then we developed a theory. We're assessing and reviewing preliminary results, refining and rerunning those measures nationally, and then finally integrating them for use. So I'm not going to bore you a whole lot with some of our literature review, but essentially we learned when we scoured the literature, uh, talking about a theory of accessibility and the measures themselves. There's a couple things. The big idea that we needed to fully understand where the theory has come from and where it's gone over time to identify some common themes or commonalities to help develop that new theory. We understood that migrating the theory from a theoretical universe of options to observed set of real behavior would actually take some effort. And here's kind of what we found. First, access is usually measured from a perspective of locations of origin or the perception of destinations. An example of an accessibility measure from the perspective of origins would be, say, the number of grocery stores within a 30-minute travel time of where you are. Conversely, for destinations, it would be the number of low-income people within a half-mile radius of a light rail line. Next, we learned that access can generally be summarized by four components. Transportation, which is the supply of infrastructure and transportation options, their characteristics, and passenger or freight movements. Land use reflects the distribution of the supply and demand of opportunities in space. This includes the distribution of populations. Time, the availability of opportunities at different times of day and the time individuals are able to make the trips. And then the individual itself, which reflects the needs, capabilities, and desires people have to make trips. Therefore, access measures are generally geared towards a couple of perspectives. On the individual-based and location-based measures, and then origin versus destination-oriented measures. Now, I realize I am grossly covering an incredible amount of research, but one thing I did not want to do today would be to dive too deeply into the weeds of many of the measures that are out there. Remember, one of our project goals was to keep things simple. So now we also had to do another simultaneous first step. We needed to look at what data are currently available that could be used in this effort. We first started with what we knew everyone generally has access to, things like infrastructure data, traffic movement, travel costs, time, spatial populations, land distributions. This included elements like open streets data, GTFS data, volume, congestion levels, transit fares, travel distances, census, NHTS, etc. But we knew that there are also a lot of emerging data sets based on probe data that offer a lot of unique opportunities out there. These are things like speed, trips, or trip path data. And thanks to our partners at INRIX and their generous donation, we have been provided with a full national trips data set. These data provide origin, destinations, start and end times, mileages, and classifications for data for every trip in their database during the provided periods, which was July and October of 2019, which equated to about 3.3 billion trips, including consumer and freight trips. This piece provided ample opportunity to examine real access behavior. So we know there's some problematic issues with these data since they are just motor vehicle, but baby steps, and we think we've developed something that could be multimodal. So in our theory development, at this point, we set out on this phase by taking what we learned through examining accessibility theory and the measures and what data we had available to use. Recall our goals. We needed something that's easy to teach, describe, and calculate, reflects real behavior, are good for policy, including target setting and measuring over time, and can quickly give users an assessment of a regional access. And what would be useful in practice? We first had to look at what accessibility measures we're measuring, and then we had to look at the attributes available in the data. Was there a way to roughly calculate other measures, what other measures had done with the data that we had available? So as we began to set out on this, we started with some of the low-hanging fruit. Things like average or median trip length, average or median trip time, trip origin and density, and then just trip density. The latter two being the traditional heat map variety that you see when you think of accessibility measures. Now, these four extremely basic measures are incredibly simple to calculate and display. They also provide a quick level of context for an urban area. But ultimately, there wasn't really anything new here. But now we get to some of the new stuff. Again, we wanted to focus on simplicity. We wanted to look for a way to portray these origins and destinations that made sense and rolled up the granularity a bit. We also looked for a way to convey some of the core concepts of accessibility at an urban area level and a more granular level than if possible. Let me tell you, coming up with a new theoretical concept that met all of these criteria was actually kind of difficult. In fact, at a certain point, we had to ditch one idea completely and revamp it because we fell into the trap that most accessibility measures fall into. It got too complicated. So we broke that into concepts into much simpler parts. And here's what we came up with. We developed three sets of measures based on three core theoretical concepts of accessibility. Coverage represents the extent of an urban area trips from all over the city can reach. Density, which is a factor of design, represents the proportion of trips in a certain area that started or ended there. And what we're calling reach is a factor of compactness or not, depending upon how they look at it, which represents average trip distance of all the trips in the region. These three concepts can be calculated in several ways, providing useful accessibility information. First, they can be calculated from uh, an origin and destination perspective. And second, they can be calculated at a zone level. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Third, due to the metadata that was provided in trip data sets, we can slice and dice these in several different ways by like trip time, so 15, 30, 60-minute intervals, time of day, all day, peak hours, non-peak hours, and by vehicle type. So all vehicles, commercial and freight vehicles, or passenger vehicles. So in theory, we could actually use this to create freight accessibility for the first time. So let's talk about the first measure that we came up with. This is called coverage and examines how much of an urban area local trips can reach in given time constraints. Note that I'll be referring to zones or hexagons, but I'll get into that a bit later. We developed a measure called the Accessibility Coverage Ratio, or ACR, which can be calculated from an origin or a destination perspective. For origins, it represents how much of an urban area all the origins from one zone can reach within that constraint. This is represented by a percentage, number of destinations reached by that one origin divided by, or origin zone, divided by the total number of zones in an urban area. So as you can see from that equation below. For destinations, it's the opposite. It represents the number of origins that are destined to that particular zone. To create a single measure for an urban area, you'd create an average score based on all the zones in a city. So you sum all of those up and then you divide it by the number of zones in that area. This creates a measure that we're calling total real urban coverage. Now, in a perfectly accessible city, this number would be 1 or 100%. In a perfectly inaccessible city, this would be 0. So, for example, if your score was 75 or 75%, the average that all your zones in a city could reach would be able to reach 75% of that city. Now, let's move on to the next concept that we developed. Density follows a similar path as the first. In this measure, each zone is scored based on how many trips they either originate or terminate in a given zone. This is then divided by the number of total trips within that urban area to give a percentage of trips that zone contributes to the urban area's transportation. In this case, a score of 1 would mean all trips belong to that one zone, and a 0 would mean that none of the trips can be attributed to that zone. So, based on the regional goals for that area, different density targets could actually be set. So, for example, if you wanted a denser urban area, like downtown, or say in Austin, an area like the Domain, which is a secondary business district, you can set a higher target for those areas, where you can set lower targets for areas that you know will never densify that heavily. This means that this measure provides a significant amount of policy flexibility, but there's one catch with this. It would always require that these goals or targets always accompany the scores, which, in my experience with policy, that's actually really important because a measure without context is fairly pointless. Now, in the same way that we calculate a single value for coverage, we can also calculate a single urban area value for density. In this case, we're calling it area, origin, or destination density, represents the average trip density of each zone across an urban area. This can also be used in policy and target setting by creating a target density for the entire region. And now remember, this is not going to be 1 or 0 because it's an average of all. The other useful thing about this measure and all others that we've created is that since we are normalizing the values by city size, you can easily compare one city to another, which is something that we can't do in the general mobility measures in the Urban Mobility Report. Now, the final concept we developed is called reach. Reach essentially measures the average trip distance based on the path traveled, not the path as the crow flies, for each zone. This provides a unique perspective to determine how compact or sprawled trips from each zone are based on the goals of that region and the attributes of that zone. For example, in some cases, you might want to reach the reach of a zone to be quite small, which would indicate a level of compactness and self-containment. However, attributes such as topography might make a zone's average trip length much longer, say in Pittsburgh. This could also be a good internal measure for a zone with targets to decrease the reach of a certain area or to make it denser, or more walkable, or more transit accessible. Or conversely, one could view a larger reach as an indication of more accessibility across the city in a given time frame. Either way, the measure provides a certain level of flexibility for the planner and the policymaker to kind of use it how they want it to be used. Now, much like the other two concepts, this one can also be rolled up into a single value for an urban area, which we're calling area reach. Area reach is the average of all the zonal reach scores in miles across an urban area. Again, based on policy goals, this measure could indicate a level of compactness for a region or a level of access. Conversely, it could also measure a level of sprawl, depending upon what your goals and targets and how you frame it are. Now, that's the theory. Now we get to our test case. To test out these theories and kind of see what they look like, we use the TRIPS data produced by INRIX for the Austin area. These data contained their entire sample of commercial and personal vehicles for the month of July 2019, which equated to about 6.4 million auto trips that both began and ended within the Austin urban area. We excluded those trips that began outside or ended outside of the urban area. We also needed a way to kind of manage these trips in a uniform way, but also provide some sort of additional fuzziness to the data since we're dealing with origins and destinations. While we could have used their individual start and end points we were given, which were already fuzzied a bit, grouping them into zones made them a lot easier to work with. Now, to do this, and if you squint really closely at the screen, you'll see some hexagons. We use the H3 hexagonal hierarchical spatial index, which maps the entire globe in a fixed manner from multiple resolutions. This method, developed by Uber, allows us to uniformly compare urban areas of any size with one another all over the world. And since the hexagons don't change, It allows for a stable comparison over time, more so than other options that are commonly used, like census blocks or TASs. We use the H8 resolution, which is what you see on the map, that have hexagons that are edged approximately slightly less than a quarter of a mile and have an area about 0.45 miles. And in the Austin area, when we clipped the urban area shape over the hexagons, it gave us about 1,626 zones that we can now use. Now, what we did first is we calculated all the measures at the urban area scale, which can eventually be compared with other urban areas. And unlike the current methods in the UMR, areas of any size can be directly compared to one another. And the standard slice that we're using for this variable set are trips made all day, all vehicle types, and trips less than 30 minutes. And you'll notice if you look at these numbers, in most cases, the origin and destination values are roughly the same or nearly the same, though I've seen that this is not always the case. And this is likely so because we constrain the trips to both those starting and ending within the urban area. And I think in the future, we're going to experiment with doing, expanding the theory one way or another. So now you'll see that the access, we have about an average of 20% access for all the zones. The average origin and destination density is about 0.06%. And the average destination reach and origin reach are about 5.2 and 5.3 miles. So that's kind of the overview from the urban area level that you would see published in a accessibility chapter of the UMR. But what about more granular data? Now, before I jump over to a Tableau viz at the zone level that I wanted to show you, I wanted to show you a standard accessibility map of Austin. This map was produced by the University of Minnesota's Accessibility Observatory, which puts out amazing work, by the way, and shows auto accessibility for 2018 at the census block level. We couldn't get 2019 map because it was unavailable, but you should notice the differences and similarities between this map, which is the hypothetical set of access to jobs, versus the one that I am about to show you. And let me
I'm
now.
gonna, hey, I'm gonna pull it
Yeah,
up. But Phil, before I hand it over to you, there was a
sure.
question in there that somebody was looking for just a repeat of the model of this method. I apologize.
Which method is that?
I guess oh, somebody. Oh, Jack answered. Look at. Thanks, Jack. You're the best.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead. You can do the live
Okay,
demo now.
let me share my screen. And are you seeing a Tableau visualization with a map?
Yes, we are.
Awesome. So this is ultimately what it looks like. Now, remember, if you recall the map that you were just seeing, your basic accessibility covered a much bigger region than what people are actually doing. And if you're unfamiliar with the Austin area, I'll point a couple things out to you. You have the Colorado River, which flows right around here. And this red dot, and I'll actually zoom in here, this is downtown. So that's going to be your densest area. You have another little pocket right here, and that's going to be probably your Capitol complex and your University of Texas campus. And then you have a really big pocket up here. This right here is a second CBD called the Domain. And this right here is a big master planned commercial development called the called the Arboretum. What's interesting about this is that you see a lot of access in some of these core neighborhoods, and you see some out in neighborhoods that you wouldn't necessarily expect. You also see, I need to change the pan on here. You also see that some of the coverage from some of these other suburbs is quite large. So interpret that how you may, some of these suburbs actually have really, really good access. Another thing that you'll notice right here is I-35, and then you have MOPAC or Loop 1, which are the two north-south highways, and then you have 183, US 290, which kind of does a zigzag here, and then you have 130, which comes out way outside of the urban area here. You'll notice that when you look at some of this, some of your biggest coverage from an origin based also occurs along freeways. Now, much to the chagrin of many planners, that is actually to be expected. If I were to change this from origin based to now where destinations are, so these are the concentrations of where destinations are coming from, or where origins are coming from, you see a lot more of downtown light up because more people are coming to downtown. You see more people coming to these commercial areas, but you also see some of the industrial areas light up. And if I were to switch to commercial vehicles, you can really see where the freight accessibility starts to come into play. You see these big freight corridors pop out, and you see some of these areas up here, which are highly industrialized zones. You also see a lot of the residential areas around the west, south, and north start to disappear. Now, this is during all day. We can switch this to non-peak hours or peak hours. We can also look at just consumer vehicles. So this would be more type job trips. And we can also expand this or contract it to a 15-minute period or a 60-minute period. Kind of interesting. Now, we can also, let me reset some of these. We can also start to look at trip density. Now, this is a little different. So remember, oh, and this is destination based. Let's switch back to origin based. Remember that now the red are what percentage of the trips are starting in each zone for the entire region. So you see a lot of the low density parts of Austin create very few trips. You also see that downtown during all day period creates a lot of trips, but you also see some of the denser, more compact, more, in my opinion, well planned and well maintained neighborhoods in the core also create some really high value, both north and south of the river. You also see some neighborhoods up in Cedar Park and the Leander area, kind of along this 183 corridor, also provide good access. Now, finally, let's look at trip distance. So these are the average distances in miles that trips that start in that zone create. Again, you have, now it's kind of the inverse. You have a lot of these in the hill country part of Austin and further out in the hinterland having longer average trips. So that means they're commuting more versus some of the core, which have the smaller average trip lengths. Also notice that there is some level of self-containment going on because you can see some of these trips in these neighborhoods up here don't actually go very far. Now, if I were to switch to the peak hour, let's see if that changes a little bit. It does a little bit. A lot of these shrink down to much smaller, and I think that's because I have an outlier right here. Let's exclude this one. There we go. Yeah, there we go. Now you see a lot of these other ones during the peak hour, it looks like commuting might still be an issue. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of show this off. We're going to be creating these for the entire nation for all first 101 urban areas in the urban mobility report, and hopefully, depending upon how long it takes to calculate, for all 494 urban areas in the US. And this is for July. We're also going to create, we have data for October, and we're going to create a different set for that to look at how school being in session impacts this. Stephanie, I'm going to give it back over to you to switch back to the last couple slides. All right. All right, so next steps. Once these Austin results have kind of been reviewed, we're going to review the code again and make sure that there's no errors in our calculations, in our formulas, and how the code calculates things. And then we're going to have our peers review these results, kind of do a sniff test and be like, does this actually make sense intuitively, or is there something that we need to tweak? At that point, we're going to run the code for, again, all 101 primary urban areas and other urban areas if we have, and then we're going to publish these results in our UMR accessibility supplemental for a regional view. So with that, that kind of ends my presentation. It looks like I nailed it right at 45 minutes. Are there any questions for me? I know I covered a lot, but here we go. In a nutshell, how would you describe how your model improves on others, like University of Minnesota's Accessibility Observatory? That's a great question. And I think one of the things that's important to remember about this is that traditionally calculated accessibility measures still have a significant amount of value that they can provide because they're providing really good planning measures for us to use with that universe of hypothetical trip options. How these measures and this theory complements that is you can actually look at, okay, say a city puts a focus on increasing their accessibility throughout the region. With these measures, they can actually see how well those efforts are working or not working by overlaying these two ideas on top of one another. So, for example, with the map that I just showed you versus the map from the University of Minnesota, if we overlaid these two, there would be some areas where their maps showed there wasn't a whole lot of accessibility, but in reality, there was, and vice versa. So it provides some really good comparison between the two. Is there a way to input community values or policy priorities like improved physical activity, lower GHG, and emissions? That's actually a really good question that I was thinking about a couple days ago. I think there are, though I don't know if we have quite gotten there yet, since these are fairly new. I kind of would like to see how people start to use them um, to create community value measures with them. I know for lowering GHG emissions and things like that, you could look at these measures as a way to increase density or compactness to try to look at that self-containment and see what actually changes that or not. You could also see how transit might impact some of these scores. Since these are auto-focused, I know that's one of the biggest weaknesses at the moment. They can easily be augmented with things like if you have a bike share program in your city, most cities have made trip data like this that we used mandatory to be provided. So we could integrate bike data in this and make it a truly multimodal measure. How would you, yeah, looks like I started to answer the question, the next question. So integrating other measures into this to make it multimodal. So there are several different data sets out there that mimic or mirror this for different modes. The bike share one that I just mentioned isn't a great proxy of actual bicycling, but it's kind of the best we have at the moment for trip origin destinations. There are other private companies who have or claim to have good non-motorized data sets. We at TTR in a different project are actually kind of evaluating some of those and making sure that they are actually what they say they are. Transit has some information that could be augmented. I think transit would be probably the most difficult because we'd have to do it at the stop level and counts of passengers based on each stop. That gets a little trickier, but it's not quite impossible. There is also, hold on, a measure called total peak period travel time that we developed almost 10 years ago that is a mode neutral multimodal travel time measure that integrates all modes, including teleworking, and can give you a single average regional travel time that would work really well with this. Um, so what would look to adopt non-SOV? So yeah, so again, non-SOV transportation, kind of in a similar vein. I think one of the things that we would like to see done with this theory and these measures would be to start looking at different modes individually and seeing how access improves in different areas across these three measures with the different modes. So you would either, and this is a policy goal for your own region, you could either look at neighborhoods specifically, how certain modes increase or decrease over time, how the motor vehicle accessibility increases or decreases over time. If you have in your local region the depth of transit data, you could calculate this from a transit perspective fairly easily. Um, Walking is probably going to be the most difficult um, mode just because we don't have a lot of walking OD type information. Though, again, I think private um, probe-based data sets might eventually get there. I don't know if they're there yet, though. I don't know if those answers the last three questions. I hope it does. Feel free to contact me as well um, if you would like to chat more about this. I would love to kind of get these theories in the hands of practitioners and start thinking about how these could be used on a practical level.
And Phil, I'll throw a question out here.
Sure.
What's the next step in this research?
That's a great question. So, like I said, one of the things that we're going to do now or next is calculate these for all for the entire nation. And essentially, our desire to do that is to make it easy for people to start using them, so they don't have to go and calculate them themselves. I think after that, the next step would be to look at that multimodal component um, and start integrating the lowest hanging fruit and working our way up. So things like the bike share data, that's pretty easy to get. I think the other thing that would be really exciting to look at would be freight accessibility for the first time, looking at how, um, and Jack, he's our analyst, and he'll probably hit me for this, but trying to split out those delivery trucks versus the long haul freight trucks and look at delivery accessibility because with the pandemic now, that is a big deal. That is being able to have things delivered to you is a pretty big aspect of accessibility now. So being able to look at that would be another really cool kind of next step. Let's see here. It looks like there's another question. What are you most hopeful in terms of the application implementation of your model, or how planning and engineering practice could be impacted by this work? So, I I really hope that this could be used to progress the ideas of accessibility and good design. Um, One of my kind of soapbox things is that we in the transportation world so often, and I'm using a very large collective we, so often forget that land use is so completely interconnected with transportation. And a lot of times, from the transportation perspective, we forget that there are other reasons that people move where they do, and there are other agencies responsible for transportation other than a state DOT and vice versa. And it's going to take a collective, holistic approach. You know, maybe solving a transportation problem is solved by increasing schools in an area, school quality in an area, because then people might move to where those schools are, and you can preemptively, build up the correct type of planned development or infrastructure to meet that future need. So I think this push towards a holistic approach and livability is kind of what I want this to go. This is kind of a first baby step. I liken this to when mobility measures were first being developed back in the 60s through the 80s. This is kind of where these measures are at now, and accessibility in general. There's been a lot of work that has been paved up until now, and I really hope this is kind of the next step in that direction.
Okay, Phil, it doesn't look like there are any other questions, but what I will do is I will open up the evaluation for everybody who is logged in. So, again, please take a few moments to complete that evaluation, as the feedback provided is not only important to the NICR webcast series, but to our presenter today. Did you have any final comments, Phil, before I do the really, really final wrap up?
No, I think that's about it. If you're interested in your city and you're not in the 101 in the urban mobility report, please reach out to me and let me know, and we can just go ahead and toss that in. Again, Jack will probably get really mad at me for saying that, but what's another couple hours of computational time in the cloud? So go ahead, if you're interested in your urban area, let me know, and we can make sure that we get that one knocked out for you.
Perfect. So, on behalf of the National Institute for Congestion Reduction, our next webinar will be scheduled on March 22nd. Go ahead and get subscribed to our newsletter so that way you will be notified when registration is open. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. We'll see you all real soon.
Thank you.